Welcome to the second talk in our Tombs of the Isles talk series. This talk we have Professor Colin Richards talking about death and burial in Neolithic Orkney. This talk has been divided into two parts, and this is part one. If you'd like to find out more, please visit our website at archaeologyorkney.com/Tombs of the Isles. I'd like to warn you that this talk contains images of human remains in skeletal forms.
Welcome to the first of two talks on the tombs of Neolithic Orkney. And in this first part, I really want to set the scene, looking at the Neolithic more generally and how tombs fit into this early stage of farming. Let's think about the Neolithic more generally in Britain. People seem to arrive from the continent, certainly into southeast England, around 3900 BC. And what's so remarkable is it seems to spread, or people arrive right the way across the British Isles and Ireland within a couple of hundred years. So our first date's around 3700 in Orkney, and we have people coming in who seem to have a wide repertoire of farming resources, if you like, because they seem to have domesticated animals, and they also have cereals, barley and wheat. The earliest dates we have for the Neolithic in Orkney come from mainland, and they were found, surprisingly enough, when a Bronze Age barrow was being excavated, and that sealed a deposit of barley and charred material, which produced the date of 3700 BC. We're not quite sure what the settlement's like. That's going to be investigated further in the future, but there's definitely a settlement there, and it's a very early settlement. Now, when we think of the first settlement or Neolithic settlement in Orkney, we tend to think of stone houses. But actually, the very first farmers who arrive here are building their houses out of timber. And we now know there was far more timber back in the early Neolithic than we previously thought. The discovery of these timber houses relatively recently, and two sites are really well known for this, and that's Harbreck on Wyre and Wideford Hill on mainland. First farmers also bring a new range of equipment with them, and this is basically because they're doing different things. They're farming, and they have to process foods, butcher animals, and so on. The most well-known ingredient of the range of material culture in the Neolithic is pottery, and the first farmers make a very distinctive style here called unstonware, and that has a sort of collar with herringbone design around it, as in the picture, but they're also using much bigger vessels with round bottoms. Accompanying the pottery, we also see a range of stone tools, and in some instances, they're very much geared to processing materials. So we have querns with rubbers for processing barley and wheat, but also polished stone axes, polished stone tools. These are quite beautiful objects for woodworking, felling trees, a whole range of different purposes. So these are very distinctive Neolithic artifacts. Apart from the more portable range of material culture, one of the distinctive elements of the Neolithic we see right the way across Britain and Ireland is the building of monuments. And those monuments in the early Neolithic are very much to do with the dead. It is these monuments which are to do with death that we call chambered tombs. They vary across the country in design and the way in which the chambers are built. Up in the very north of Scotland, we see a very distinctive form of architecture. It tends to be linear chambers, and they tend to be subdivided by opposed upright stones, which we would call orthostats. And what these do is they divide this linear space into a series of chambers. A good example of this architecture is the large tomb of Mid Howe on Rousay. This has any number of different compartments, a very long internal chamber. And that's the thing which actually marks Orkney out from the rest of the north of Scotland, is the chambers become exaggerated, and the space which is enclosed can be very long. These are very impressive monuments indeed. Because this is linear architecture, it has a start point and it has an end point. And interestingly, in these stalled chambered tombs, we find that the last cell or chamber is marked at the rear by a massive back slab. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it's the last thing that goes into the building of the tomb. Let's think a minute about the dating of these monuments. It's actually quite difficult to date construction because you simply have pits and stone built on top of each other. But what we can do is we can date the contents. We can date the burials which go into these monuments. So basically we can date the use of them. In the 1980s, a chambered stalled cairn was excavated by John Barber at Point of Cott on Westray. It's called a horn cairn because it's got hornworks coming out, but these are a later addition. The actual initial tomb is a typical rectangular stalled cairn. It contained a series of burials which produced a series of dates, and we can see in retrospect they sort of cluster around sort of start just before 3500, and then there's some slightly later deposits going in, later burials around 3000. And then there's a gap, and the late dates, which you see at the bottom, these are from animal bones, which go in right at the end of the Neolithic in the period we call the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age. So not only is Point of Cott seemingly built and used at the very beginnings of the Neolithic, but it also, through its later hornworks, has a relationship with those which are found in cave nests. So here we see quite clear links between the inhabitants of Orkney and the very north of Scotland. So far we've seen that from the very start of the Neolithic, apparently chambered tombs monuments are being built. And at first glance, they think, okay, these are just for burying the dead. But actually, if we just think about Point of Cott, there was not that many burials in there. I think there was about 7 or 8. So this begs the question of where the rest of the people are being buried. And this starts to throw a different light on the chambered tombs themselves. So for the rest of this presentation and then running into the next talk, I want to look at a series of questions. So what are chambered tombs? Are they really just large chambers for putting the dead in? Where were they built? Was the position they were situated important? And if it was, why were they put in these particular places? And were they really encased cemeteries? Well, I think we already know that that's not likely given the few numbers we've seen at Point of Cott. Were they all used in the same way? Again, this means that the same burial rites existed all the way across Orkney and presumably Caithness and Sutherland too. And that too, I think, needs to be investigated. We just can't assume that. And how did they change through time? Well, this is where things get really interesting because some really broad radiocarbon projects of chambered tombs in the south have suggested that rather than being open for a long period of time, that is, taking in the whole of the community over several hundred years, they were very short duration, and that's why there's very few burials in them. And were they just monuments? Well, that is, were they just ordinary monuments, or were they something different? Remember, the Neolithic is incredibly different. The people is very different to us. It's an alien world. The people saw the world in a different way, and consequently, they'd have seen their monuments and their architecture in a different way too. Let's start by looking at the distribution of chambered cairns in Orkney. And we instantly see that, yes, there is a broad coverage from the very bottom of South Ronaldsay to the tip of Westray. But if you look at the distribution, it's very uneven, and certain places seem to have far more than others. For instance, just look at the distribution of tombs on that south and southern area of Rousay in comparison to large chunks of mainland Orkney. Is this merely that they've not been found? I think not. I think this is a real pattern, and it does show that some places or some people back in the early Neolithic were building monuments fairly frequently, whereas others apparently weren't. Accepting the difference in distribution that we see across Orkney, and of course, whether this translates into some groups not building chamber tombs and others building them is difficult to say at the moment, but it's quite possible. But where we do have them, we see they occupy two different places in the landscape. The first is at the very edge of the land, that is, on the seashore, cliffs above the sea. They seem to be on the periphery between the land and the sea. The other location they occupy is again peripheral, inasmuch as it's up on the slopes of hills. And this is a good example. This is now a Biaso on Rousey, and it's up on the higher terraces. Interesting thing about this is that it overlooks the land of the living. That is, it's where the farming's taking place, where the settlements are. Whereas those on the coast, well, those can be seen from the sea. So we're seeing two different distributions or two different places in the landscape, both of which may be being positioned so they're highly visible, but from two domains, the land, the everyday land of the living, and those over out to sea. Now let us think about how these distributions have been interpreted in the past. And the first person we want to look at is Gordon Childe, probably the most famous archaeologist ever. Childe was the Abercrombie Professor at the University of Edinburgh, took that chair, I think, in 1929, and worked extensively on Orkney. He excavated Skara Brae, he excavated any number of chamber tombs, and he also worked with Walter Grant at Rousey. And it was while Childe's on Rousey with Grant that he notices there seems to be a correspondence between the distribution of tombs and the distribution of townships or farms on Rousey. And he's the first person who really starts to speak about these tombs being equivalent to a particular community or family group. This line of reasoning is extended in the 1970s and 80s by almost an equally famous archaeologist, Colin Renfrew. Renfrew is very much concerned in scales of monumentality and different types of society. So for him, the bigger monuments equate to a larger political formation. But initially, his concern was identifying territories. So he wanted each tomb to relate to a particular territory. And this is an example of his, and he too looked at Rousey as well, interesting enough. And so in this example, we can see the position of the tombs, and we can see the lines that Renfrew has drawn to create the territories. And we instantly see problems. There's a group of tombs down in the south which are right next to each other, and it's hard. You can see he's drawn small lines between them. It really doesn't work. So it's not quite as an equivalent um, between people and tombs as Renfrew would like. If we can't draw lines between these monuments like Renfrew did, where are we left? Well, there's definitely a correspondence between tombs and settlements. We know this through the various research projects which have been undertaken. The question is what that relationship is. So I think for a start, we should think about a slightly more nuanced approach and not general patterns. That is, things will vary in different places. And as we've seen, in some places there's no chambered tombs at all. But in others, you may get an equivalence between one tomb and several settlements, one tomb and one settlement. But what is that relationship? This is the crucial point. We can have a look at some examples, two particular examples, which are featured in recent research projects. The first is Quantoness, and it lies on the very lower slopes. It's further down slope than a lot of tombs, but it's still elevated, and it looks over a settlement known as Crossy Crown, which is an interesting settlement because it starts at the very beginnings of the Neolithic, runs through, and is constantly being remodeled. But there we do seem to have one settlement with being equivalent to one tomb. And as we'll see in the second talk, that tomb is full of dead people. But were they all from that settlement? Things appear quite straightforward when we think about Crossy Crown and its relationship to the tomb Quantoness. But just literally a few metres round the corner, we have the tomb of Wydford Hill, which is situated much further up on the slopes of Wydford, looking over sort of western views. And that's directly associated and certainly visible from two settlements. To the north, we have Smercoy, which is a really interesting settlement. It looks like it has a series of early Neolithic houses, almost like an early Neolithic village. And to the north is the Wydford Hill settlement, which starts off as timber houses and then turns to stone. So what is the relationship between this and two settlements? And things become even a little bit more interesting or complicated when we think probably both settlements pre-existed the building of the tomb, so it comes slightly later. So what's its relationship to those two settlements, and also what's the relationship between the two settlements themselves? And as we noted when we were looking at the overall distribution of tombs on Orkney, this picture becomes even muddier when we realise that actually some settlements don't seem to be associated with a tomb at all. And it seems that Harbreck-on-Wyre hasn't got an associated chamber tomb, and an early Neolithic settlement at Deepdale, there's no signs of a chamber tomb there either. So things are much more complicated, perhaps as you really should expect. People are simply doing things differently in different parts of Orkney, and it may well be that we're actually dealing with different people coming in from different places in different parts of Orkney. We have seen there's no set pattern of relationship between settlement and tombs. In some instances, there seems to be this sort of one-to-one relationship. In other cases, one tomb may relate to several settlements. If you think about the landscape situation of the Orkney tombs, particularly the tombs situated on the higher slopes of the hills, they're looking over the settlements. They're looking over where people are herding animals, where they're looking after crops. They're basically overlooking where people lived, and they're permanent settlements. If we venture outside Orkney, we see yet another picture. So if we go to the Outer Hebrides, the Western Isles, chamber tombs there too. But they're not overlooking the dwellings, they're not looking over the lands or the living. What they're overlooking is the valleys and the passages of movement. And this is something we should need to bear in mind, that Orkney may be particular, may be different. That is, it has permanent settlements. These turn more and more complicated and become larger, so eventually they're going to get to the size of Barnhouse, Skara Brae, Nessa Brodgar. In the Hebrides, people seem to be far more mobile. They're moving around with their cattle and animals. And so it seems appropriate, therefore, that in these places, the tombs overlooking the passage, the movement between places, whereas in Orkney, they're overlooking the sedentary, settled land of the living. Now we think about who goes into the tombs and what happens to them in the tombs when they're in there. Different people have had different ideas. For Renfrew, when he was thinking about territories and chamber tombs, his assumption was that these tombs were what he called open access. That is, all the members of the community are deposited on death in the tombs. He based this on the results of his excavations at Quantones, which seemed to have a pretty wide distribution of men, women, and children, seemingly supporting his ideas. This was nothing new. Richard Atkinson, back in the 1960s, also had this idea, and he tried to work out the population of Neolithic Wessex by looking at all the numbers of people who were buried in earthen long barrows, which is what you find down in Wessex. The results were lamentable. For Atkinson, the population was minuscule and clearly wasn't correct. For Renfrew, the thing about Quantones is it's very different from most of the other Orcadian chamber tombs. So this raises that question once again. Who is going into the tomb? Why and what happens to them? To think about this more clearly, I think we have to think more about whether there's all deaths are the same, and whether a different form of death may influence what happens to the body, to the corpse after death. And the things we should think about here are where death occurs, the way in which it occurs, and as with all societies, does the attribution a good death or a bad death make any difference about who actually goes into the chamber tomb? If we accept that there are different types of death, which may result in a different treatment of the body after death. For instance, one of the things which we may be familiar with is, what is a bad death? Well, perhaps it's out of time, it's out of place, and perhaps the most extreme form is suicide. And of course, we know historically that suicides were treated differently after they were buried outside churchyards. They were often buried at crossroads, and so on. So the type of death may well influence the mortuary practices, as we would call it, that are associated with them. Another element we have to take into account is the rite of passage. That is, the stages that have to be gone through, or the ritual stages which go on through, but to take the living person to the realm of the dead. And that's often done spatially. That is, perhaps starts off within the house, and the movement of the body from the house, let's say, to the chambered tomb, is all part of this ritual passage between life and death. And with some deaths, it may end up in the chambered tomb. In other deaths, it may end up somewhere else. So we have to think about the nature of death and the rituals which are surrounding death to get some idea of who or why people might end up in a chambered tomb. So let's think about the rites of passage spatially. As I said, the good death, appropriate death, perhaps takes place in the house surrounded by one's loved ones. After death, there has to be some mechanism, and often it's spatial and temporal, that charts the passage between life and death. It may be the movement of the body from the house. It may be the movement of the body from the house and being cremated and put into the monument, because in some of the cave nest tombs we find cremated bone. But in Orkney we don't. And this notion of rites of passage has been looked at by several scholars. Now, one of them is quite interesting. I'm not sure how valid it is, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and that's by someone called Riley, and it was published in 2003. And he said that when people died back in the Neolithic, they were put in tombs at the lowest tombs at the base of hills, and part of the rite of passage was their removal from these lower tombs and to be placed in the higher tombs, certainly, presumably, when the flesh had rotted off from the bones. So it's the bones themselves which are transferred. I don't think that actually works, but that's an example of how this notion of rites of passage has been used in archaeology to account for the different forms of skeletal remains you find in some of the chambered tombs. This notion of Riley's, that you see the removal of parts of the body, particular bones being taken out of the tomb, perhaps and put in other tombs, is an interesting idea, and it's certainly an idea that I played with when I first started looking at Neolithic Orkney, where some of the tombs which have large numbers of bodies, e.g. Quantoness, I wondered whether we were seeing a final depository, and in a bit like the way that Riley argues the movement of bones upslope. I think things have changed a little bit now. I still think that in Orkney you do see a degree of removal of bones, and I think you perhaps see a degree of placing bones in other tombs. But for generally, is the tomb the final resting place? That is, when the corpse is put in, is it left for the flesh to decay, and the bones perhaps are pushed to the back of the tomb, and then when another person is interred? So we have to think a little bit more carefully about who's going into the tombs and what happens to them once they're in there. We will address these issues in greater detail in the next talk, but to finish this one off, I just want to go back to the actual architecture of the monuments we've been looking at, that is the stalled cairns. And on the slide here is Mid Howe, and this really shows more than any other site just how interesting this sort of linear architecture is. And just putting aside for a minute the burials in the tombs, what's this architecture doing? Why is this form of spatial organization been selected? Well, the most obvious thing is, just think you're coming in along the passage, that's on the right, you're entering the chamber, and as you pass through these opposed orthostats, what we call chambers, you carry this, it's almost like you're going through graded space. And of course, as I said earlier, by definition, a linear space has a point of entry and it has a goal, an endpoint. And so is the actual architecture of the tomb and sort of representation of rites of passage. That is, people coming from the outside, the living people, going through the architecture of the tomb and eventually enter into the realm of the dead. It's certainly been argued, I've certainly argued this, that when you think about what you see when you go through the tomb, that is the sort of architecture which you encounter as you pass along, it is like a series of doorways. Because if you think about the Neolithic houses, they too have these orthostats projecting out, and these are the doorways. So the actual imagery of the tomb in this instance is by walking along through the chamber, you're passing through a series of doorways. And then, if you remember, I said about the back slab, this big back slab, which is put in later on. So you go right the way through the tomb, and then you come to a doorway which is basically closed. Closed to humanity, but is it closed to the spirit? I think it is important to think about the architecture of these monuments because architecture is literally built in such a manner to fit in with a series of practices. That is, the practices you want to occur within a space are determined by the architecture itself. And that's the stored cairn architecture is such a distinctive form. And I really like this idea of passing through a series of doorways, and that in some ways being an equivalent to passing from this world to the next. But let's return to the dead people who are actually taking that passage. And this chart is really just to show you how variable the numbers of people are who are found in the monuments. And you can see in many cases there's less than 10. In some instances there's none. I suspect that's more to do with what we would call taphonomic processes. That is, the soil conditions can make the bone decay and disappear. But overall, you'll see there's great variation in numbers in the tombs. And so, earlier we spoke about was the same mortuary practice occurring throughout Orkney and perhaps even Caithness and Sutherland? Well, I think just looking at these numbers, we can say, no, actually, it looks like every tomb is a little bit different. And of course, in two examples there, Quantiness and Isbister, the Tomb of the Eagles, we have hundreds of people interred. So why is that? And why should we see that sort of variation between places and tombs and different people and different communities? And that's really what we're going to be talking about in the next lecture.